Okay, welcome back. We are now going to start All Quiet on the Western Front. Um, Good book.
Mm-hmm.
You like this book?
I did. I didn't used to, oddly enough. When I read it in college, I didn't like it very much. Well, that's not fair. I read it probably simplistically and didn't really appreciate the depth that it has. And it's got a
Mhm.
surprising amount of depth in it if you read it carefully.
This used to be on the high school curriculum.
Yeah.
Uh, for probably from, say, the late 1940s through the 1970s. People read this book in high school, probably because it was short and it was sort of a classic.
And it is an easy read. I mean,
It
it's
is,
well
yeah.
written. It flows. There's not a lot of stylistic complexity to have to parse through.
Would you even call it a novel, or is it more like interlocking short stories?
It's episodes.
Yeah.
To use a modern kind of imagery, it's a TV series, right, with episodes that are not necessarily chronological, although many of them are, but meant to be in some way standalone moments or ideas.
I thought it was a lot like the Vietnam novel, the things they carried.
Yeah.
You've got stories here, and they kind of form a collective whole unit, but they don't have the follow through of a novel that you expect from a novel. Well, let's talk about what I really want to talk about in this first little segment is a passage on 12 and 13, which I've used just to discuss literary modernism with students. Because when we talk about the history of literature, we generally divide it into periods of major things happening in Europe and America at the time. And literary modernism is a period that begins largely after World War I and is a reaction to World War I. And just to kind of set this up, before World War I, the intelligentsia of Europe and America was really pretty optimistic because they had done a lot of cool stuff. I mean, they had Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, and they were figuring out music, and they had the great philosophers. They had great literature, great poetry, great art, and there was this real humanistic sense that human beings really could produce things, and there was progress in the world. We've gotten better since the Dark Ages.
And in addition to those kind of ideas and cultural issues, they're very practical kind of inventions that made people's lives easier on a day-to-day basis. There's the automobile, along with, for most people, public transportation like subways and trams, so that you didn't have to walk 5 or 6 miles in the morning to get to work. There's clean water. There's elevators. There's telephones, so you can call home. Or, in fact, you can listen to a concert on the telephone if you can't afford a ticket. There's newspapers that everybody can buy so that everybody can read the things that the intelligentsia are writing. There's airplanes, there's zeppelins, which are dirigibles, right? Very practical, physical signs of the apparent truth, with quotations around apparent, that people now can control their world and at least to some extent their fate in it.
So this is science.
This is science.
Science has given us a better world.
That's right.
And I remember seeing early century kind of advertisements saying that we used to have, and there was this narrative that had been evolving for some time in the West, that you had a great period of ancient classical antiquity. You had the Greeks and the Romans, and they achieved things. Then you had the Dark Ages that were dark. Then after 1,000 years or so of Dark Ages, you had a Renaissance or a rebirth. Then you had an Enlightenment, where and things in this just keep getting better and better and better, and science came along and cracked the code of nature and gave us indoor plumbing and automobiles and telephones and railroads and clean water and things just keep getting better and better. And then along comes World War I, and science is sort of at the basis of how we figure out new ways to kill each other. and commit just really atrocious acts. I mean, this is a war of science in some ways, isn't it?
This is a war in which the creations that were supposed to make our lives easier and better and supposed to be under our control, to be our servants, turned out in a way to be our masters.
Frankenstein.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And you're actually, students reading this now, I think, are better positioned to understand this novel than people reading it in the 70s were, because the period right before World War I is quite parallel to where we are now, I think. I'm not suggesting the future will be the same, but we live now in a world of great technological progress, in a world where we can master information in a way that makes our lives easier and more efficient and makes us seem smarter and better. We live in a world where we can do more things more quickly, more easily, and yet there are those hints around the edges that all of this progress that we are, all of these things that we are creating might not actually be good for us, and the impact of them might not end up good.
Like there could be a downside.
There's
To the internet.
risk. Yeah, there's all kinds of challenges and complexities coming up, right? You all on the other end of this camera are getting ready to graduate in a year or two, and all of the writing about the future of work raises these issues about whether robotics and computerization is going to decrease the need for humans to work. That's the world they live in too. There are hints of that in the same way there are hints now. But most people in living in 1910, 1912, 1913, only see those hints, right, around the edges, and most of their life they see themselves living in a golden age.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it comes crashing down on them.
Because of the very things that were
Yes.
supposed to produce the
Exactly.
golden age.
Yep.
You know, the tanks and
Yeah.
the mustard gas and all of a sudden you have this great new killing capacity that came about by the very science that was supposed to be the great fruit of the Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so is it significant that this happens in a school?
It is, and particularly in Germany. In Germany, all of these countries and all of the people at this time emphasize education and emphasize the people who can bring you the kind of knowledge that's embodied in this new world. But especially in Germany, the profession of being a teacher or in a college situation, being a professor is enormously highly regarded, right? Much
Yeah.
more important than being an athlete, much more important than being a movie star or a celebrity, right? You look up to your teachers, you respect your teachers. Now, if you're the age of the people in the scene, and you're not working somewhere, that means you're on the college track, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who are not on the college track are out of school. And you'll notice there were no girls in this scene, right? There were only boys.
Yeah, what's up with that?
Well, girls, by this point in time, it was legally possible for girls to be in universities.
Mm-hmm.
There were a couple dozen, probably, by 1910 or so, who were in universities, but this is not expected. The only profession as a girl you could go into was being a nurse or a social worker or something like that. You certainly could not be a teacher in a school like this, which was designed to produce leaders.
Okay.
And if you're here, right, this is your hero, right? He is the person who has control over your future. This is the person who has the knowledge and the wisdom you're there to gain, and this is the person you should listen to.
Okay. So this what's really a propaganda speech, and
Yes.
we have that on page 11 and 12,
Mhm.
I think, too. And it was kind of hammed up in the movie because this was a 1930s movie, and that's how they did movies in the 1930s. But during drill time, Kantorek gave us long lectures until the whole of our class went, under his shepherding, to the district commandant and volunteered. I can see him now, as he used to glare at us through his spectacles and say in a moving voice, "Won't you join up, comrades?" So the teacher, the bringer of knowledge, is also bringing this really nationalistic idea, right?
Yeah. Now, I should say, we use the term propaganda. I think that's an accurate term. But remember, propaganda can, in fact, be ideas you truly believe in, right? So the
Yeah.
teacher here is not trying to persuade them to do something he does not believe in. He is a passionate German nationalist who believed that his prodigies, his proteges, should similarly be passionate German nationalists. And the way to be a German nationalist is go to fight for your country.
But when he actually is called on to fight for his country, not so much.
Well, yes. And in fact, this is the difference between the book, which is episodic, and the movie, which
Yeah.
is more or less chronological. Because when you see the scene in the book, even though it's very close to the beginning of the book, it's Boimer looking back
Yes.
and remembering this not through the eyes of the kid who's listening eagerly, waiting to be persuaded, but looking through the skeptical, ironic eyes of somebody
Yeah.
who's seen what happens and says, boy, I wish I hadn't paid attention to him. All of these teachers were spouting this nonsense, and we all believe them.
And he even, in the movie, not in the book, but he even uses that line, dulce et decorum est pro patria more, that we talked about in the last module.
And if you pay attention to his language, he uses some really revealing words, right? He talks about men. What are men supposed to be? Men are supposed to be men of iron, right? And then he talks about, are your mothers so weak, right? And this is all very gendered. And men in this period, right, the great fear where they were going to be weak people working in the factories who were just going to be kind of pale, sallow creatures who, of course, then would fall prey to these other ideas floating around like socialism and communism. Instead, you need to be hard, like iron. And remember who the example is he points to? These are the Romans, right? That's who you're supposed to leave. And that leads right into the poem.
Right. So, but it all comes together. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, classical learning. That was all about being more like the Greeks and the Romans. And so this nationalism and this martial urge comes with that classical learning and really, I think does a really good job of showing how the same thing that is empowering Europe at this time is destroying Europe at this time. So we go to 12 and 13, and I love this line. This is the bottom of page 12. The idea of authority, which they represented, was associated in our minds with a greater insight and a more humane wisdom. But the first death we saw shattered this belief. We had to recognize that our generation was more to be trusted than theirs. They surpassed us only in phrases and cleverness. The first bombardment showed us our mistake, and under it the world, as they had taught us, broke in pieces. And that's as good of a theme of literary and philosophical modernness as I can think of. The world falling apart. Yeats said, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. He's writing that in 1918. So things are falling apart because it's all connected. Science and technology and classical learning and liberal arts and the war and the bombs are all connected. So where do you go?
It's not clear where there are hints in this novel which suggest where to go, which tie back to that issue of generation and authority, right? And you'll see it, I think it's on 140. If I've got the page right, it might not be that exact page because I'm doing this off the top of, yes. On 140, down toward the bottom of the page, right? Where he's talking about what's going to happen after the war, which he doesn't really talk much about in this novel. It's actually, through much of the novel, it's pretty clear that he doesn't actually see himself coming out of this war. But when he lets himself imagine what the end of the war is going to be, right, he says, and this is the second paragraph from the bottom, and this I know, all these things that now, while we are still in the war, sink down in us like a stone, after the war shall waken again, and then shall begin the disentanglement of life and death. The days, the weeks, the years out here shall come back again, and our dead comrades shall then stand up again and march with us. Our heads shall be clear, we shall have a purpose, and so we shall march, our dead comrades beside us, the years at the front behind us, against whom?
It's like sort of a cross between a communist revolution and a zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, and you get both parts out of that. I like that passage because it gives you both the uncertainty, right? Because you don't really know the target.
Right.
It's not clear because he might actually have a target in here and just not want to say it. But it's also possible he doesn't really know quite who to blame.
Right.
But somebody's to blame, and you got to get rid of them, take care of them, whatever verbs you want to use, because you cannot allow this to happen again. Right? So there's the collapse of an ordered world, and yet a determination that somehow you've got to put it back in order. You just don't quite know how.
Yeah. That's a dangerous position because it gives you just a lot of sort of free revolutionary labor for someone to pick up and lead. Yeah. Could lead to communism.
And of course, what happens after the war in Germany is that there's a whole variety of politicians and publicists who pick up on this desire to do something, but this lack of clarity about what you should do.
Let's talk, and we'll in the next module we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we go now? What do we do? But let's talk about that scene. It starts on page 168, where Boehmer goes home. And what happens when he goes home? He's looking forward to this because he wants to go back to his world, and specifically back to his books.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to him when he goes home?
So as a preface to that, as a setup, remember that this is the 1910s, not the 2010s, right? So in our world, he would have been Skyping with people the whole time, and his kids would have, well, he doesn't have kids, but other soldiers who had kids would have been in contact with him. He would have talked to his mom and his sister and his dad. He would have known, in fact, that his mom was sick, right? Probably. But in their world, the only way they have of contacting people is with telegrams. And these telegrams are closely censored by the Army. And in fact, usually they're given a script on a telegram and allowed to circle one of the options on the script that will describe to them what mood they are in and how they're doing. Right?
What version of happy and wonderful they are.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And so in the book, right, we are all surprised in the 2010s because they don't know he's coming.
Right.
And yet there he is, and he's been thinking about this and dreaming about this at the front, and then as he goes, although remember it is significant that he's a little regretful that he goes, because he's leaving the people that mean the most to him and going to the people who used to mean the most to him and don't anymore.
Right.
But he gets there, and what he finds is that he's not at home anymore. Right? Remember, leaving, to go on leave, right, you're supposed to go home.
Mm-hmm.
And the big point in many ways of this chapter is that he's leaving home to go to his birthplace rather than leaving the front to go home.
Right.
And he finds this out when he sees his sister and his mom. He finds this out at the cafe where people all want to buy him beer and want him to tell them how well it's going and want to feel vicariously like they're part of the war because they're buying a beer for a soldier. But then he especially finds it, as you say, in his own personal library, which was what was most meaningful to him before the war. And now he can't read it anymore.
That's just so telling to me.
Mm-hmm.
He used to take great comfort in his books.
Yeah.
The books used to help him make sense of his work.
Mm-hmm.
And here on page 172, a terrible feeling of foreignness suddenly rises up in me. I cannot find my way back. I am shut out, though I entreat earnestly and put forth all my strength. Nothing stirs, listless and wretched, like a condemned man. I sit there, and the past withdraws itself. At the same time, I fear to importune it too much, because I do not know what might happen then. I am a soldier. I must cling to that. Wearily, I stand up and look out of the window. Then I take one of the books, intending to read and turn over the leaves. But I put it away and take out another. There are passages in it that have been marked. I look, turn over the pages, and take up fresh books. Already they are piled up beside me. Speedily more join the heap. Papers, magazines, letters. I stand there dumb as before a judge, dejected. Words, words, words. They do not reach me. Slowly, I place the books back in the shelves. Nevermore. Quietly, I go out of the room. Now, that nevermore, that's an illusion, isn't it?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, because I've never actually read this book in German, and I don't know what the German word that's used there, but the translator choosing nevermore, because that's not an accident.
That's what the poem The Raven is about. The narrator of The Raven says Edgar Allan Poe. You've heard The Raven, I'm sure. His wife has died, or his lover has died, and he's going through his library trying to find, Poe says in his book, surcease of sorrow. He's trying to find something in his book that will explain the death of his loved one. And all that the books say is nevermore. He can't make sense of the death of a beloved person through all the books that are supposed to help you make sense of the death of a beloved person. The books don't work anymore in Poe. And that's what's happening here. The books don't work anymore.
Yeah. Except here, whereas Poe is talking about the death of a beloved person, Remarque is talking about the death of a world. And a world that cannot be explained anymore, that cannot be retrieved, that cannot be returned to, a world that is gone forever. And
Yeah.
what do you do now that your world is gone forever? And your new world is indescribable.
Now, is this, I mean, most people in Germany aren't young intellectuals who read a lot of philosophy. I mean, most people in Germany are farmers at this time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how does this play out? I mean, this is how a very educated person is going to understand this problem. You know, these books, this education, this science, the philosophy, all of it has failed me. How does this translate into somebody who may not even be literate?
Yeah, it's so there's one broad point I want to make about this, but one caveat to start with. And the caveat to start with is that while many Germans are not reading these kind of works, or they're not reading Kant or Goethe or the people that would be on his bookshelf, nevertheless, the literary culture is what everybody kind of aspires to in Germany, right? This is what you want your kids to do, even if you don't do it, even if you know that your kids are probably never going to get there, right? So that's the caveat that this scene would in some ways resonate with people if they could read this book as a scene of what they had dreamed for their kids or grandkids is now not attainable. But the big point to make is exactly as you say, most people don't have stacks of books on their shelves anyway, right? And the experience of war that Remarque lays out in this book is probably experienced differently by many of the people who were coal miners or railway workers or agricultural workers who worked double shifts most of the time. Or if you read memoirs or articles about people who were agricultural workers, this is the time when mechanization of agriculture was just at the very beginning. And so it's not unusual to work 100, 104-hour weeks during harvest season. Yeah, it's extraordinary. And this is one reason why you have so many agricultural accidents, because they're all drinking all the time in order to make it through a 100-hour week. That world is dangerous all the time and painful a lot of the time. And so they come to the trenches, and it's just a worse version of what they're used to. For somebody like Remarque, who went to school and read, that world is dramatically different from the experience they have in the war. And it's probably more shattering for people like that than it is for people who are used to hard physical lives before they got to the front. Nevertheless, even if you're used to hard physical lives, and even if it's not quite as much of an adjustment, you're still not being killed on a day-to-day basis on a farm.
And on a farm, you're doing all of this work, and at the end, you see a result.
Yes.
There's a crop that comes in.
Yeah.
And you at least see that your labor has had some effect.
Yeah.
Is that happening here at all?
Not here.
Yeah.
Now, again, there's a little bit of question about how representative this book is, right? Because he talks about, for instance, the dog fights. He doesn't use that word, but the fights between planes that the infantrymen looked at and bet on and kind of looked at as theatrical spectacle. For the pilots, this actually is kind of conceived as a duel, as the duels would have been in the medieval period, where you can test your courage and your skills one-on-one against somebody else, and you can prove yourself to be the better man.
Snoopy and the Red Bear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's the isolated exception. For the most part, if you'll notice here, he doesn't actually talk about people getting killed with rifle shots, right? Very rarely. It's people get killed by machine guns, and people get mostly killed in artillery bombardments.
Or just dysentery.
Yeah. Well, or disease, right?
Malaria.
All of these are out of their control, right? They are passive victims. The only way they can improve their chances is to dig farther down, or to maybe recognize that tiny little slope that you see is actually enough cover that the machine gunner might not get you. But you really have no agency. You have no control over your life. You have no control over the likelihood that you will continue to live.
And even if you make great sacrifices, I don't even understand what progress looks like in a war like this.
Yeah, and from an ordinary... Now, this is always a problem for a war, right? Because ordinary soldiers only see the target in front of it. Nevertheless, they're fighting over basically the same part of land, the same little piece of land. through the entire book. And for the most people on the Western Front, they're fighting over the same small area of land, and we'll probably throw a map or two up describing that or showing that visually. But they're fighting over the same territory for 4 years. Right? And the gains that they make, whatever rewards, whatever success, is measured in maybe 100-yard movement of the line or 200-yard movement of the lines. Right? They measure even the generals measure progress in half a kilometer. Right? So a quarter of a mile.
Okay, well, let's wrap
Yeah.
this segment up, and we will be back, as soon as you want us to be, with that dramatic scene with the French soldier in the trenches. All right, thank you.